We've officially made it to the introduction. It's taken a while. But Kant starts out the introduction in an interesting way. Something I wouldn't have thought he would do. And he states, there can be no doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience. And so, he sounds a lot like an empiricist. Knowledge is based on experience. But he continues, and I think this is kind of a pretty good summary of, at a high level, what, before I really read Kant, what I actually knew about Kant. He states, for how should the faculty of knowledge be called into activity, if not by objects which affect our senses, and which partly produce representations by themselves, partly rouse the activity of our understanding to compare, to connect, or to separate these representations, and thus to convert the raw material of our sensible impressions into a knowledge of objects which we call experience. And so, to the point I was making, when I think of Kant, I think of somebody who kind of established this idea that we aren't just kind of passively taking in the world. We're very much, our mind is very much an active agent in our experience. So if you just I like to just think about my experience when I'm kind of moving through the world, and the fact that I'm recognizing a lot of objects, I'm placing them into categories. I am thinking about what they do. I'm focusing on certain objects and not focusing on other objects. I'm organizing all this stuff. My brain is organizing all this stuff automatically, and I know what most of the things are that I'm taking in already. I don't have to think about them. There could be a very different experience. It could be that every time, and I think this is what Kant is trying to get at, we're not just being fed raw data every single time, right? It's not like you wake up every morning and you're like, okay, there's I think what's that, a chair? It's like, no, we know our surroundings. We've experienced them before. We're categorizing everything. We're processing things automatically. We're separating them into different things automatically. So the mind is doing a lot of work without even us really thinking about it, and it appears that the mind is bringing a lot to experience and doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the background to categorize this, so it's not just this kind of raw experience of just sensations and objects that are being presented to us. And I think it's a really important thing that Kant talks about in kind of one of the quintessential Kantian things that I think of personally when I think of Kant. So Kant continues a bit later. But although our knowledge begins with experience, and this is where he's emphasizing that it doesn't end just with experience either, it does not follow that it arises from experience. So I think the point he's making here is, knowing stuff, figuring stuff out, categorizing stuff begins with taking it in. But that doesn't mean that knowledge is from experience alone. It takes a lot of other stuff. Kant continues, for it is quite possible that even our empirical knowledge is a compound of that which we receive through impressions and of that which our own faculty of knowledge supplies from itself. And I think that goes in, pretty nicely with kind of what I was just talking about. All right, so Kant goes on to then ask a question. And he asks whether or not there exists a knowledge, something that we can know, that is independent of all impressions of the senses. So independent of all experience. Is there anything that we can know? And that kind of brings us to, I'd say, two categories of knowledge, two different categories of knowledge that each have two separate buckets. And this is the first one. So Kant is distinguishing between a priori knowledge, that is knowledge that exists prior to, separate and apart from experience, and then a posteriori knowledge, which is knowledge based on experience. And I think Kant really wants to drive this distinction home. It has to be automatic by the time you're really getting Kant, because he uses it so much and it's like so fundamental to his thinking. And the reason I point that out is because Kant actually points it out too, that we don't necessarily apply a priori very well in our own life. And he gives the example of a house falling down. And so, there's this rickety old house, and the average person looks at that house and they're just like, wow, that house is going to fall over. And so since we haven't experienced the house falling over, that'd be considered a priori knowledge, right? Effectively, like we have a lot of things that we learn based on experience and then apply to subsequent experience, or we have a lot of knowledge that is based on experience that we don't necessarily have to experience additional things in order to predict them. And that's not the kind of, that may technically be a priori. We haven't specifically experienced this house falling down, but Kant wants to make the point that he is concerned with like pure a priori knowledge. So it is completely independent of all experience. So there's nothing you can bring to it whatsoever. We have to effectively, within our mind, know this completely separate and apart from any experience. Kant then goes on to, and I find this to be a little confusing, to be honest with you. In section 2, he starts to talk about effectively different types of a priori knowledge. And the two categories here are, something is a priori if it's necessary, it's one, or if it's too strictly universal. And so related to the necessary a priori knowledge, Kant states, if we have a proposition which is thought in conjunction with its own necessity, we have an a priori judgment. And if besides this, it is not derived from any proposition except one which also has the validity of a necessary proposition, we have an absolutely a priori judgment. Okay, so just to unpack that. If we have a proposition which is thought in conjunction with its own necessity, we have an a priori judgment. So if something, there's a proposition and effectively it has to be true, it is necessary that it is the case, that's an a priori judgment. And then Kant goes on, and if besides this, it is not derived from any proposition except one which also has the validity of a necessary proposition, we have an absolutely a priori judgment. So I'll be honest, I'm not 100% sure about the distinction of these two things. I think what Kant is saying is the first one is kind of just, it might be, to preview a little bit, something that is kind of definitionally true. It kind of has to be the case, like all circles are round, all bachelors are unmarried type of thing, because it can't, those things have to be true necessarily. Whereas the second part, something that is not derived from any proposition except one which also has the validity of a necessary proposition, that could be a little more kind of true based on reason. So you are putting forth a proposition, and that proposition actually has to be valid, not definitionally, but because it is the case, and then it becomes something that is a priori. Well, to talk about necessity really quick, if something has to be true, it makes sense that you would consider it a priori, right? Because you don't have to experience it. So if you know that, all bachelors are unmarried, right? You don't have to experience every bachelor or, survey every bachelor to know that they're unmarried. that is necessarily definitionally true. So it is true, separate and apart from experience. The second one is something is a priori if it is strictly universal. And Kant states, experience never imparts its judgments as true or strict, but assumed or comparative universality through induction, so that we ought always to say that so far as we observed hitherto, there is no exception to that rule. And so Kant is essentially saying nothing based on experience is strictly true. And this kind of goes back to Hume a little bit, but every time something happens and we experience it, it doesn't have to be the case. There's nothing making it so it has to be the case. Maybe it always has been that way, and we're experiencing that way. The sun always rises in the east. Okay, it has happened every single time, but there's nothing logically inconsistent about the sun the next day rising in the west. Supposing something happened, I don't know. So nothing based on our experience is like completely universal. So I think Kant is making the point here. If we find something that is strictly universal, we understand that it applies in every single instance. That's not based on experience, right? Because we can't experience every instance, nor does experience give us the data that would be universal, that something is universal. So if something is strictly universal, Kant takes the position that it's a priori. It is true, separate and apart from experience. So Kant gives an example. Each alteration must have a cause. And he says, cause and effect. So something changing. There's always a cause to it. Nothing changes for no reason whatsoever. If everything stayed the same and nothing new was introduced, then nothing would change. And Kant makes the point that cause and effect, these ideas are so closely intertwined that they're always true, right? And this is not based on experience, right? Because we can't experience every cause and effect. We can't know every cause and effect that happens. So Kant is making the point that this is a pure a priori judgment based on strict universality. Every cause has an effect. I think he'll talk about this more later in a subsequent section, but he faults Hume for making the mistake that we could establish this via frequent association. I think Hume didn't believe that. He believed that we couldn't do that, but that was the only way that we could establish something as strictly universal. So Hume looked to frequent association, was said that's pretty much all we have to talk about cause and effect, and it's not good enough. Like I was saying, like things absolutely could be different the next time something happens. So frequent association isn't really good enough to tell us something true about the world. It merely is just that, an association that we have based on something happening previously, but it actually gives us no reason to believe that something will happen the same way in the future, or at least no way to defend our belief that something will happen exactly the same way in the future, other than, well, it happened that way in the past. And then Kant, I think, foreshadows something that he does in the Transcendental Aesthetic, and he talks about the fact that not only judgments, like reasoning and definitions that we've been talking about, can be a priori, but also like concepts that we experience. So he takes the example of a body. And so let's say you have a red square, and maybe if I figure out how to use editing software, there will be a red square on the screen right now. So let's now take away the redness of that square, right? So we still have a square, but now it's, there's no red, there's no color. Okay, now let's take away the sides of the square. Okay, we don't have a square anymore, but we still have space, and we still have time. I don't think Kant uses time in this analogy, but we're always still left with space. And that, Kant says, is like an a priori form that we can't take away. And therefore, like I said, it's true regardless of whether we have experience with it, because it's kind of a necessary building block of having experiencing a concept at all. In section 4, Kant talks about the second bucket that I was kind of previewing. Kant points out that there's essentially two possibilities for ideas. So you have subject A that you're starting with, and then you come to predicate B. And there's effectively two ways that you can arrive at predicate B. Either predicate B can be something that was contained within subject A or was outside of it, and you had to do some reasoning to arrive at it. So that first option, so if predicate B was always within subject A, that's called, Kant calls that an analytic judgment. So an example of this would be what we talked about before. All bachelors are unmarried. So once you know what a bachelor is, the definition of a bachelor is somebody who is not married, right? So we start with subject A, a bachelor, and then we get to predicate B, they're unmarried. And the question is predicate B, the fact that a bachelor is unmarried, within subject A or outside of it? And the answer is, it's definitionally, that's what subject A is. A bachelor is someone that is unmarried. So predicate B always existed within subject A. And all we had to do was look to subject A to establish predicate B. That is an analytic judgment. So essentially, analysis of subject A can result in predicate B. The other option is subject A, or predicate B is outside of subject A. So another way to think about this would be, so an example of this, I guess, would be all bachelors are lonely. So if we look at bachelors, there's nothing that tells us that in the definition of bachelors that they're lonely. They might be, they might not be. And so what we have to do is we have to look outside. We have to actually go and talk to some bachelors. It might turn out that all bachelors are lonely. Probably not. But we have to do something. We have to do some analysis, some reasoning, maybe some factual tests, take some surveys to figure out whether predicate B is true. So that is a synthetic judgment. It starts with subject A, and in order to get to predicate B, there has to be some mental or physical combination of the two acts that occur in order for us to arrive at predicate B. And the examples that Kant used are slightly, probably better, I hope so, better than mine. The example that Kant uses for an analytic judgment is all bodies are extended. And so what's the definition of a body? Well, it's something that, exists in the world and has kind of substance to it, and it is like definitionally, it has some sort of size to it, and therefore it is extended. And so Kant is making the point, like, this is an analytic judgment. Predicate B extension exist in our understanding of what a body is. Okay, and then Kant, for a synthetic judgment, uses the example, all bodies are heavy. And so the question is, well, in my understanding of what bodies are, can I surmise that they're all heavy? And the answer is no. A lot of bodies are light. So if we look at our table, essentially there's 4 possibilities. So there's synthetic a priori judgments, and that would be something that's not based on experience, but that we cannot tell unless we do some reasoning or we do something to arrive at it. Spoiler alert, that's by far, frankly, that's Kant's big innovation, and it's by far, it's the most important part of the critique of all of these that we're talking about. Across from that, we have a priori analytic judgments. And so an example of this would be all bachelors are unmarried. So we don't need to experience that in order to understand that it's true. But part of that is because it's just definitional. It's analytic, and so the predicate exists within the subject, and we don't have to actually figure anything out. Nor do we have to experience anything in order to figure it out. Okay, and then another possibility is synthetic a posteriori or a posteriori. So that would be, and to just talk about what Kant says that all judgments, all empirical judgments are synthetic. And this kind of makes sense. To go to the last category would be analytic judgments based on experience. And it's kind of just a complete contradiction. Experience is, what we experience in the world, but an analytic judgment is, in particular, something that lies within something we already knew. So experience can't tell us anything about analytic judgments. So the whole idea of an a posteriori analytic judgment is just kind of, frankly, unimportant and a contradiction. But Kant also makes the point that empirical judgments are all synthetic, and then he makes the point that I just made. It would be effectively a contradiction if you had an analytic judgment based on experience, because experience is outside of those concepts that we're talking about. But the synthetic a priori judgment is Kant's major breakthrough. And it kind of goes back to the question that he asked in the beginning. Is a judgment, or is an idea that is completely divorced from all experience possible? And this is the answer. Yes, synthetic a priori judgments are pretty much precisely that. So it's something before we experience anything, but it's also something that we don't just know definitionally, but we have to reason to get to the judgment. So then Kant asks, how is this possible? How can I get from subject A to predicate B, which again, predicate B is outside of subject A, something new, without any experience? In section 5, Kant goes a little deeper into into these distinctions. And first he talks about the fact that he talks about math and makes the point that all mathematical judgments are synthetic. And the idea, I think, is there's some basic building blocks of math, but effectively everything that we're doing in math, even down to basic addition, is something that we can't know just from the definitions. And so Kant gives the example of 7 plus 5 equals 12. Well, before I say that, so he says that all mathematical judgments are synthetic, but he also says that they're a priori, because they are necessarily true. They possess necessity. So like 7 plus 5 has to be 12, right? And so Kant again kind of teases out the fact that we don't necessarily experience the world in this way. And he kind of makes the point that 7 plus 5 equals 12 feels analytic. It kind of feels definitional because we just kind of automatically do it. But it actually isn't. So if you just think about it, if you think about like you have 3 sheets of paper that you're reading consecutively, and you have 5 on one, you have plus on the next one, and you have 7 on the third one. If you kind of just experienced all those individually, would you ever get to 12? I know it's kind of a silly way to think about it, but there's nothing intrinsic in those similar to, all bachelors are unmarried, or every cause has an effect, or every alteration has a cause. When you do 5 plus 7, you actually have to, like, for example, somebody who didn't know how to add or didn't, like, they wouldn't be able to figure that out just based on knowing 5 and 7 and what addition is. And Kant says effectively, we have to get from 5 plus 7 equals, which tells us that we know that 5 should be added to 7, but we can't get 12 from these concepts alone. They don't exist within the concepts of 5 plus 7. We have to actually, and the way I like to think about it is like somebody counting on their fingers to like figure this out. You don't just like get to 12. You have to go, 5, 6, 7, 8, and there's reasoning and logic, and if I add one more, what'll it be, in counting and stuff that has to go into it, even though it feels quite definitional and automatic to us, just as we experience it in everyday life. And then, the upshot of what Kant is really getting at is math has synthetic a priori knowledge. It's possible. And, Kant's larger point is metaphysics is meant to have synthetic a priori knowledge. Like, we are unable to experience metaphysics. We have to, through a critique of pure reason, you might say, arrive at, before you experience it, like without experiencing it, conclusions that are outside of the definition of metaphysics. So this is what we have to do in order to do metaphysics. And in this, we don't want to just analyze concepts, but we want to expand our knowledge a priori because we can't experience this stuff. And that is what Kant is going to argue needs to be done in metaphysics. In section 6, one of the big focuses is David Hume. And we've already kind of touched on this a little bit, so I don't want to beat this horse too much. But I'll beat it a little bit. So Kant effectively starts out like, how are these judgments possible? These synthetic a priori judgments. It seems like kind of a contradiction. And I'm going to quote him here related to Hume, just to kind of put a bow on what we were talking about earlier. Kant says, quote, confining his attention to only to the synthetic proposition about the connection of an effect with its causes, principium causalitatis, probably not saying that correctly, Hume believed he had discovered that such an a priori proposition is entirely impossible. According to his conclusions, so just to stop there, what Kant is saying is, by just focusing on synthetic cause and effect, and not focusing at all on a priori, like the fact that we can reason and deduce things and figure things out outside of experience. By just focusing on the experience aspect of that, for cause and effect, Hume was right in what he was saying, that we can't know anything outside of experience, and cause and effect is merely just something that we are assuming will continue to manifest in a way that it always has, but we really have no basis to defend that position other than that's how it's always worked. But Kant points out a really big flaw in Hume. He goes on, quote, "According to his conclusions, everything which we call metaphysics would turn out to be a mere delusion of rational insight into what in reality is only borrowed from experience and has, by mere habit, assumed the appearance of necessity." And Kant goes on to say, well, he didn't say this, but frankly, Hume might be right about metaphysics, but what he can't answer is how he would be right about math and science. Because, as Kant's pointed out a few times in a critique so far, there are a lot of instances in math and science where we're doing making a priori synthetic judgments. So things we couldn't possibly experience, and that are not, definitionally within themselves, that are outside of our current understanding. That kind of stuff happens all the time. Like theoretical physics. Think of infinity. Think of, there's just a ton of examples. I mean, I think Kant takes a position that effectively all of mathematics is this. And, Kant obviously takes the position that we can do the same thing with metaphysics. We can use this synthetic a priori approach, and like math and science, we can use pure reason to show that synthetic a priori knowledge of metaphysics is actually possible. And that's kind of one of Kant's main aims in the critique of pure reason. All right, so section 7 is the last section of the introduction, and it's really just kind of setting up the reader for the project a little bit more. But the biggest thing that I think he does is he introduces the idea of what transcendental means to him, and what Kant is trying to make clear is that he's not just concerned with reason, but he's concerned with pure reason. And the word he uses to describe it is transcendental, and he uses transcendental a lot. And transcendental he kind of defines as knowledge which deals not with objects, but with our manner of knowing objects, insofar as this manner is possible a priori. And so I was kind of reading the definition that I wrote out from Kant, but what he is saying is, we're going to talk about our knowledge of objects and stuff, but that's not transcendental. When something is transcendental, we're talking about transcendental knowledge. We're talking about our ability to know an object in an a priori manner. Yeah, so it doesn't just deal with our knowledge of objects, but is concerned with how we know objects, insofar as this is possible a priori, like without actually experiencing them. And he, makes the point that a system that uses this would be called transcendental philosophy. And then Kant makes kind of a couple of points related to what he's actually going to do. He says, quote, "It is not meant to," meaning the critique, "it is not meant to expand our knowledge, but only to correct it, and to become the touchstone of the value or lack of value of all a priori knowledge." So I think, I've heard a few people kind of talk about this, and I've read about this, like, Kant isn't actually taking the project to its completion. Effectively, what the Critique of Pure Reason is setting up what the project would be, like kind of setting up the experiment, giving us the ability to actually use our reason to engage in metaphysics in a meaningful way for the first time. But he is not going to, in the critique, put that into place and then tell us what metaphysics actually is. But I mean, that's kind of the most important part, though. And I think that's encapsulated in the next quote. Kant says, "Only once we are in possession of this critique do we have a reliable touchstone for estimating the philosophical value of old and new works on this subject." And, we've talked about it a little bit, but I think, like I said, Kant is mostly concerned with actually setting metaphysics on the right course, as opposed to believing that he can just kind of solve everything in one fell swoop. So obviously, it's most important to be on the right path. And I think that's what Kant believes he's doing, setting us on the right path, not necessarily completing this journey for us.